Obviously, we're probably a fraction of the size of VHA, so we can look even closer at those agreements from a enterprise level. So at each of our districts, as well as in our Office of Resolution Management within VBA, we do that same thing.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Radewagen. Ms. Bradley, Dr. Benishek.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to touch on something a little bit different than I think the whole gist of the meeting here this morning is, and that is my concern is that the average employee is not getting evaluated in the process of making sure that infractions are not documented, so that we have to use this special agreement thing because you don't have the documentation in the record to justify the disciplinary action stuff. And, you know, a couple of years ago, Gina Farisi, the Assistant Secretary of Human Resources and Administration at the VA, told me and this committee that she was writing her own evaluation, and that it was common practice for employees to write their own evaluations and have them simply be signed off by their supervisor. And, you know, in my opinion, that's a way for make it easier for the supervisor, but it doesn't really document any problems that might be there with the employee. And then later on, when, you know, the problem is worse and worse, there's no documentation in the employee record that there was a problem that was attempted to be corrected. Is that still going on in the VA? This was 2 years ago, she told me that.
I think that it is an issue, and it's so much of an issue from my perspective that I've had several meetings with my top lawyers, so that would be our district chief counsels and the deputy district chief counsels.
So it's still going on then?
I don't want to say it's still going on. I would say it's still a concern for me. So what I've said to my attorneys is, for each and every case, when your clients come to you and they start to talk about how they might want to settle a case, I expect you to be proactive and talk about why it is that maybe the record looks a little, let's just say it's not as strong as it could be. And the reason that the record might not be as strong as it should be is because there wasn't proper documentation.
Well, that's my whole point here. Maybe,
yes,
you know, if the managers have a better control over the nuts and bolts, the
yes,
blocking and tackling of doing their managerial jobs, then we wouldn't be resorting to these special things so often, okay? Mr. Young, you mentioned that you're a former medical center director. So are you having any familiarity with this problem of people writing their own evaluations? Have you ever written your own evaluation?
I do a self-assessment, an honest self-assessment where I look in the mirror and I.
Well, that's not signed by your VISN director as your evaluation for the year.
I write my self-assessment and I provide it to the network director, and he then evaluates me and writes what he thinks about me and then rates me. And then it goes before a panel within.
So you're not familiar with this process of people writing their own evaluations?
Writing a self-assessment, yes.
I'm not aware of that problem either.
Well,
I'm aware that we
I had
have
an
had
assistant secretary for human resources tell me she was writing her own evaluation and that it was common practice. And I just don't want to see that continue to be a common practice because, as I mentioned, the reason I'm asking these questions is it doesn't allow for documentation of bad behavior and corrective action efforts and all that.
So if I could address that, from a VBA perspective, the executive as well as our employees, as part of the performance review and performance rating process, they are asked to say, from your perspective, how do you view what you've done this year? That is input to the rating that I do on the individual, but it's not the final say. The senior leader or the rater is the final say on the assessment of that individual employee. So Ms. Farisi may have indeed said that she wrote her own, but she could have been speaking about a very specific part of your performance appraisal, which is your self-assessment, which becomes a part of the record.
So how many times have you written these yearly? Everyone underneath you, do they get a yearly assessment?
So I will speak to my old job, not because I've been in this one for about 2 months. So As the chief
Yes or
financial officer.
no? Have you written these assessments for other people?
So my
Do they-
deputy has written assessments on my employees that worked for me, and then I wrote the assessment of my deputy. On every of the employees that worked directly for my deputy, I was the senior reviewing official. So let's say that,
How often do these assessments have a corrective action plan or or some sort of a recommendation for improvement?
so I can't speak to that because
So you've never done that?
I've not had the reason to do that.
I can, from my experience, I would always ask my employees to provide a self-assessment, but then I would also write an assessment of them, and in that assessment, the last paragraph would very typically be, these are my expectations for them for the coming year and the areas that I believe that they have opportunities to improve.
And then, is that ever checked again?
Absolutely, and then in the, always do a mid-year review, and just good management is having regular conversations with your direct reports about the progress that they're making in their work lives.
All right, I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Doc.